Professor Gershuny.
No, Professor Gershuny.
Professor Gershuny, you're recognised as one of the leading time use experts in the world, certainly in this country. Why do you think time use studies are so important? And how did your interest in them start?
Everything we do is located in time, and as a result, everything that goes on in the economic and the wider social world is recorded when we record representative population samples time use for a day or for a week. Time is what we have, and time is everything we have.
Okay, and here at Oxford you have one of the best data collections of time use in the world. Do you want to tell us a bit more about that?
Yeah, we have in the sociology department the Centre for Time Use Research, which is the home to, among other things, the Multinational Time Use Study. This is not, in fact, a single survey. This is a collection of surveys that have been taken in various countries at various points in the last 50 years. The earliest data we've got is from 1961, where, in fact, this comes from the UK, and this was the BBC Audience Research Department, as then was, that collected something that it called a viewer-listener availability survey. And they got people to keep a diary, minute by minute, the whole way through a whole week, just so that they knew when people were at home and when people were travelling, and hence available or not available for their programmes. We got hold of that and recoded the very detailed diary that they had, that they'd collected, which asked people not just what they were doing, but also whether they're doing something else at the same time, and who they were with and where they were. We coded this into a standard format that we've used for approximately 70 other surveys from across the developed world and now increasingly the less developed world. Each of these surveys is representative of the country that it comes from, adults and very often children also, representative of the time use of the country it comes from, and we have something like 20 countries and a span of just under 50 years. So we can tell you how the times have changed. In every single country that we look at, we find that working hours have gone up, at least for men. No, that's not true. That's not true. That's not true. Let's start again. Cut. In every single country that we look at, we find that there's a positive gradient between earnings levels and hours of work. The higher your earnings, the longer hours you work. There are country differences. In the UK, the contrasts are huge. Well-paid people work on their work days, in their work weeks, maybe above 50 hours a week, whereas less well-paid people at the other end of the scale, much lower wage levels, much more likely to be part-time employed, or if nominally full-time employed, work 37, 39 hours a week. That's in working weeks. But of course the other thing that's happened is that over this period there's been this enormous spread of paid holidays. At the beginning of the time that my data covers, only a minority of people in most countries had any statutory paid holidays. Now everyone does in every single country that you look at, and in some countries it's substantial numbers of weeks. Now, substantial numbers of weeks, considerably longer than the UK requirement. So while people are busier on their work days, over the year maybe this evens itself out. I think that there has been a transformation in gender relations. Men contributing to housework just as much as women becoming, if anything, the majority in the workforce. We do find when we add up paid and unpaid work that women and men work approximately similar amounts of time. You add the two together. There's been a continuous transfer of paid work to women and unpaid work to men. But the really remarkable thing that I think my group has discovered in the last couple of years are national differences in this process. And what we've found is that those countries that are most friendly to women in the workplace have had by far the largest transfer of activities, between the genders, the largest shift of paid work from men to women, and the largest transfer in net terms of unpaid work from women to men. If you look at the Nordic countries, which have really good, particularly really good childcare facilities provided by the state that are intended, which are there for the purpose of allowing women to have full-time jobs, and have appropriate and also have other lines of policy like parental leave that's not transferable from husband to wife, but generous parental leave to encourage men to stay at home when there are small children, and good employment protection laws. You find that this has had a really remarkable effect on the way life is lived in the Nordic countries. Denmark as being a shining example here. That's something we couldn't possibly have known if we weren't collecting these sorts of time use statistics. And it's a lesson that I think is not yet having sufficient purchase in public policy terms, at least in the UK and the other Anglophone countries. I mean, this result has been developing for the last. I mean, the evidence for this result has been developing for a long time. We've got an article in the journal Sociology last year that shows this most dramatically. But I did know this at the end of the 90s, and I do remember an occasion where I was giving a lecture in 10 Downing Street with Tony Blair and Cherie Blair sitting in front of me in the audience, and I was talking about this effect, and Cherie was looking at me quite rapt, and Tony was looking away, well, looking bored, to be perfectly frank. Well, what I can say is what I did not know at that point was that Cherie was just about to have another child. And I do remember that very publicly, when that boy child was born, Tony Blair did very publicly take 10 days father's leave Also, the media were informed by his press office. I suspect so far that's been my group's major impact on British public policy.
So generally, the impact of the internet on time use?
Well, there's a famous result from the States, which I summarise as Norman Nye's Net Nerds. What this eminent researcher Norman Nye found was that if you looked at people, if you compared people who had and did not have screens at home, the people who had screens at home, it appeared in 2003 when he did this research, those people had much less social time, much less sociable activity than people who didn't have. Now, there's a serious methodological problem with this research. It was cross-sectional. That is to say, it looked at a sample of people and it compared people who did and did not have computers at home as if this was a sort of natural experiment that showed the consequence of computers. Of course, it isn't a natural experiment that shows the consequence of computers. It shows how different sorts of people spend their time. And still in 1990, a good proportion of the people, still at the turn of the millennium, most people who had computers at home were of the slightly nerdish, disposition. They were the sorts of people who liked to spend time solving problems in front of a screen and maybe had fewer friends to start with. So what you actually have to do is not this sort of cross-section which confuses the causes with the consequences. The cause of having a screen at home at this time was at least in part that you were a rather unsociable person who preferred to have a relationship with the screen with other people. What you need to do is look at the same people and see what happens when those people acquire screens. So we did some what's called longitudinal research. We got people to keep diaries for a week on successive years, and when we compare these, we actually find that the people who spend time in front of screens actually slightly increased various categories of sociable time. The reason that work hours can't grow too much is that consumption takes time. If you're going to spend your money, you actually have to have time to spend it in. So here's a word that's not often heard, but you have to match productivity growth, that is output per minute of work, with consumptivity growth. You have to consume more per minute to match the increase in output per minute, or else you have a slump. Now, to an extent, people can consume more vigorously and more things at the same time, but basically that's not the way we want to go. What actually happens in civilized societies is that we produce more valuable things and spend more time consuming them. So our restaurants get better, and we spend more time eating our meals, slow food. Less work overall, but only slightly less work because you need more chefs and better waiters in order to produce that slow food. And that's the way you cope with large-scale technological change. You improve the quality of the services that are the end point of all the technological change. You improve the quality of the services, people spend more time consuming the services, and that also increases demand for high-skill service workers. So you shift from a long working hours, low-skill society to low skill, low wage, low hourly wage society to a short working hours, high skill, high hourly wage society. Everyone gains both money and leisure time. That's the model.
And do you think it'll happen?
No, it won't happen. We can make it happen, but if we follow current, the market won't make it happen. It happened in France, dramatically in France between the end of the 80s and the middle of the last decade as a result of public regulation. This much maligned working hours regulation that meant that working hours in France did decline to 35 per week, which actually allowed you to spend more time enjoying the excellent food that we would know that we would know is available there if we had enough time aside from our work to go there to find out. Even better, if we started eating better here, we could maybe sell those same services to the French. This is what it's all about: moving from high working hours, low wage service economy to a low working hours, high wage, high quality service economy in this country, and we can only do that if we push in that direction, and if we abandon the idea that we get rich by working longer and harder. That's just dumb.